The local elections this May are the first time that photographic ID will be required to vote. The new rules apply only to local elections in England because the Welsh and Scottish governments didn't follow suit. But when it comes to general elections, voters across the whole of the UK will be required to show photo ID. In Northern Ireland, they've been required since 2003. Now, May isn't very far away, and that's caused concerns that a large number of people in England are going to be disenfranchised by the new rules. That's because there are estimated to be 2 million people with the right to vote, but who don't have photo ID. These 2 million people are eligible to apply for a free voter authority certificate from the government, but it's been revealed that only 21,000 have so far signed up. That's just 1% of the people who might need it. Lee Rowley is a Tory minister for local elections, and he disputes the significance of those figures.
I need to take on this notion that there are 2 million people who need a voter ID. That is not correct. It is absolutely not correct, and I hope honourable members will stop reiterating it. Of those 2 million people, which is an estimate, a number of those will not have elections a large number of those will not have elections in their area this year. Secondly, of that group, a number will choose not to vote, much as we would like them to do so, will have chosen never to have voted, and we would encourage them to do so. But ultimately, that is what the purpose of a democracy is. People have a right both to vote and not to vote, and we are seeking to encourage them to do so. We're seeking to guarantee that integrity, and then ultimately there may have been a choice for people to change to postal votes, or we are continuing to work to try and encourage take-up where it is necessary, but it is fundamentally incorrect for honourable members in this House to suggest that there is some form of target which is being missed.
Well, there isn't a target being missed because it wasn't a target in the first place. We don't care if these 2 million people have voter ID or not. It wasn't a target. We don't care. These people probably weren't going to vote anyway. I mean, maybe they weren't, but how do you make sure that they're the ones who aren't applying, right? And how do we know that there aren't going to be people in May who go to try and vote in the council elections and they get turned away? Now, one, obviously they're not going to get time. They're not going to have time, right, to go and apply for that if they go in May and hadn't heard that they would need this new ID. I think the bigger problem is you're going to get a lot of people go there, they don't have their ID and they don't bother going back, right? It doesn't seem to me a particularly healthy way to have a politician talking about elections. So back to that missing 2 million, The Guardian has dug a little deeper into those figures. They report this. Just 2.4% of the 21,000 applications were from voters aged 75 or older, 505 in total, despite this demographic being among the least likely to possess a passport or driving licence, although several older people's travel cards will also be accepted. Only 1,237 people aged under 25 had applied. Younger people are also less likely to have photo ID that can be used to vote, especially as the government had decided that student cards and young people's travel passes are not valid. The Tories argue that the new rules will protect democracy. They say it's to stop voter fraud through impersonation. That's despite there being almost no known cases of voter fraud in the UK. Let's use the general election year of 2019 as an example. According to the Electoral Commission, there were 595 cases of alleged electoral fraud, and only a quarter of those had anything to do with voting. Now, most of them actually involved candidates breaching campaigning rules. So in 2019, only one person was convicted of voter impersonation and only one was issued with a caution. So it's not much of a case for completely changing the law. This was Angela Rayner's response to those figures. The Tories' voter ID plan is unworkable, unnecessary, and set to lock millions out of voting. They're spending your money on disenfranchising you. Oh, this is pretty worrying, isn't it? It does seem like gerrymandering. I mean, especially, there are certain details, for example, like older people's travel passes are going to be valid, but younger people's travel passes aren't valid. Now, that just seems very clear, like the Tories trying to make it easier for older people to vote than younger people to vote. And yeah, I mean, it seems like they're going to get away with it.
The Tories never really respected us, but their respect has gone down so much that they're not even trying to hide, the shithousery that is going on. The way that that this is about disenfranchisement of particular people, obviously the double standards about travel ID, whether or not travel documents can be considered ID, but also the fact that there's been absolutely no public communications campaign or anything about this shift taking place. I'm pretty locked into politics. It's like my job. It's what I do. I haven't personally seen any kind of public communications or any, and maybe you could argue that May is too far away from that for that to happen, but I haven't seen any kind of campaigning or anything to say, this is what you need in order to vote. This is how you get it. This is da. There's been no, in the same way that when filling in your taxes comes round, you see adverts on bus stops, you get emails, you get communication from the government giving you information of what you need in order to participate in this process. We've seen none of that for voter ID. And so this is how that really, and if you needed any more evidence, that this is about making sure that the groups of people that are least likely to vote for the Conservative Party are not able to vote for the Conservative Party. And the broader context here, I think, is one in which the Conservatives really don't feel like they can actually win elections on kind of honest and transparent terms. It's coming in the same context as the redrawing of electoral boundaries, which that process has already come under scrutiny because in December 2020, no, I think not December, I think just 2020 in general, they pushed through a law that essentially revoked the ability of Parliament to essentially sign off on a bill redrawing constituency boundaries. And they will be drawing in those new boundaries soon. And there are obviously predictions and forecasting that the way that those boundaries will be redrawn will benefit the Conservatives. And so there's this broader context where essentially the Conservatives are aware that they are very much fledgling in terms of what the nation thinks of them, that they've lost the nation to an extent. And their way of dealing with that dissent is not to actually deal with the core issues that people are materially angry about, but to just kind of manage the way in which that dissent can be expressed. And we see it with these voter ID laws. We see it with the gerrymandering. We see it with things like the public order bill, with the minimum service level bills, with all of these things that are essentially ways of dealing with dissent, not by addressing core issues, but by strangling our freedom to express dissent in ways that can actually get change, whether it's how we vote, whether it's using strike action, or whether it's protesting. And that is essentially the gasp, the last gasps of a dying party. The question is, what are they going to do to our democracy as they sort of die as an electoral force, at least in the next election, not permanently, obviously. Essentially, they're going to drag our democracy down with them. And that's the real concerning thing here.
Sovereignty of Parliament, they can get away with this because we don't have, a higher court to stop them or whatever. I assume when Labour get into power, if they were to try and take away the voter ID requirement, then the Tories would say, you're actively trying to promote electoral fraud. I'm sure there would be a lot of dog whistle racism when it comes to ethnic minorities, because when people talk about electoral fraud, that's often what they're kind of trying to prod the audience to suggest. So there's also a bit of a circularity to the Tories' argument for this, because they essentially say, you ask, why is this necessary, given that there is no evidence that anyone is doing voter impersonation? They say, well, what matters is the impression of integrity. We need people to have faith in the integrity of elections, so therefore we have to introduce voter ID. Now, I haven't seen any evidence that people had lost faith in the integrity of elections. And if anything, the only thing that's going to help them lose that faith in the integrity of elections is the Tories banging on about the idea that people are committing voter fraud when they're not. So it's very much one of these things where the Tories think, oh, this is a policy that would benefit us in election. Now let's stoke up an invented moral panic, and then we can respond to that moral panic with a policy that happens to benefit us. It's actually also not the only policy the Tories have introduced, as gerrymandering in this way. Dahlia mentioned the boundary changes. The other one, which I found kind of most depressing and annoying, is they have changed the voting rules for regional mayors. So it used to be the case, it has been the case up to now, in fact, that in those elections you get a first choice and a second preference, a first preference and a second preference. So say, I vote in the London mayoralty, of course. If you really don't want the Tory to win, but you'd kind of prefer the Greens to win over Labour, you can put Greens number 1, Labour number 2, and you can be confident that you're both expressing your true preferences, but you're also going to keep the Tory out because you put Labour as number 2. Now, there were a couple of elections, I think, where it was that voting system that did keep the Tories out, because the vote was a bit split between Labour and I think it was the Lib Dems. And so if it hadn't been second preferences, the Tories would have won. And so what did the Tories do? They just got rid of it. So now it's only going to be first preference voting in mayoralties from now on. Very depressing for the left as well, because first and second preference voting is kind of the only way that you can, safely get someone to the left of Labour in on a big election. Because if you don't have second preference voting, say in London, for example, if at the next election there's loads and loads of momentum behind the Green candidate, the biggest argument for not voting for them is going to be saying by splitting the vote, you'll let the Tory candidate in. That could be the strongest argument against any third party candidate. And now it's going to work, right? Because the Tories changed the voting rules purely to benefit themselves, because they want some Tory mayors to get in on a minority of votes because they know they can't win a legitimate majority. So all very depressing. Again, they seem to have got away with that one. That is one I can imagine Labour reintroducing when they get into power. Well, actually, I'm going to completely reverse that. They could get away with that. They wouldn't be subject to particularly severe attacks, but actually they have no interest in that because they kind of like the two-party duopoly. So I'm not sure why they would reintroduce first and second preference voting. Dahlia, any final thoughts on this story about voter ID?
Yeah, I think that the idea that people don't have faith in the electoral system, there's some truth to that. But the reason that people don't have faith isn't because they think that there's widespread electoral fraud and that IDs are going to solve the problem. People have a lack of faith because they broadly have a lack of faith in the process of democracy itself. And the reason is because they feel like the government is not acting in response to their needs and in response to what we are demanding, whether it's through what we're striking for, whether it's through what we're protesting for, or whether it's through passing of policies that have widespread popular backing. Like the broken faith in the system is a much broader issue. And I think there's a real cynicism there to the government kind of taking an emotion that is very much there, which is a sense that our democratic processes are kind of broken and are not fit for purpose, and that people are not getting what they need out of the political system, and attaching it to a policy that really has nothing to do with that. So again, it's addressing a broader feeling of dissent in the population without actually making the concrete changes that are needed to fix that, but instead going for these really surface level sort of headline grabby, irrelevant policy changes that don't actually get to the heart of why people are frustrated with the political system today.